In previous videos, we lined the underside of the roof, finished an out of plumb corner of the walls, painted the roof lining and walls, repainted the balustrades after only 5 years, and finished off a few other things for our front veranda restoration project. In this video, we'll be recapping the front of the decking using hardwood screening, which is basically the same process as fitting the decking boards. The very front of the veranda decking is still open with some rather rough looking timber in there, so we'll be fitting some hardwood screening. These are finger jointed marbu boards, 67mm wide by 15mm thick and just over 2.7 meters long. The length of timber needed on the right hand side of the veranda is 2.35 meters, so we can do this in single lengths, cut down from the 2.7 meter lengths we have. Once cut to length, we need to pre-drill the timber with holes that are slightly larger than the decking nails we'll be using. We make the holes larger so the nails don't split the timber. There's no way you can just hammer nails through hardwood without either splitting the timber or bending the nail. Same goes for the timber when nailing the boards onto, although we pre-drill these with a hole slightly smaller than the nail so the nail will grip. We use galvanized nails so they won't rust, that are made specially for decking. That is, they have a twist in them to stop them pulling out over time. It's important to pre-drill deeper than the length of the nail, because if you don't, when the nail gets to the end of the hole, it's likely to bend over, which can make a mess of everything, like we've just done. Fortunately, this is behind the bushes, so isn't that noticeable, but if it was right on the front steps, it would stand out like dog's balls. Speaking of front steps, this is where we'll be working next.
Right, to measure this one up, we have an issue, and that is, that ain't square, and neither's that one. Great.
We can measure this angle using a bevel gauge.
I think they're about the same amount out of square as each other.
And both sides are out by about the same amount. The bevel gauge is then used to mark the angle of cut on the timber. Trying this first piece out, I've cut it a bit long, so it won't go down far enough. But thinking about this, because it is in the hot sun, there will be a bit of expansion and contraction going on, so it needs a little gap either side, so this piece is ideal for the top. So we mark this out for pre-drilling. Need to get all this dead right, because it's right out in plain view, so any mistakes will be really obvious right out in the front of the house. We then pre-drill this elsewhere, like we did before. We've also got a really long drill bit, so we don't make the same mistake as before. Pre-drilling really deep into those really hard 130-year-old floor joists and beams. They look like they're a bit rotten, but what's left is really hard. They were made to last. The first nail we tap in far enough so it holds the timber in place. Then we adjust our position so we can hammer the nail into the hardwood more accurately. If we're only a little bit off, the nail can bend, even though it's pre-drilled. And if that happens, we'd need to pull the nail out at great risk of breaking the head off, making it really difficult to get out without making a mess of everything. We then move on and finish the two boards and move on to the left side of the veranda, which is more than 2.7 meters, so we're having to do it with two boards. The first one is almost the full length with only a small bit cut off, so it lines up with a joist, which is where the two boards join. The top boards have only joists to nail onto, so the joists determine the position of the nails. The second board is much shorter and is taken out of what is left over from the stairs, leaving only a small amount of waste. When drilling into really hard wood, it tends to build up in the end of the drill bit and prevent drilling past a certain point, so the drill must be pulled out and cleaned off before drilling can continue. We tend to rub the end of the spinning drill bit on the edge of some hardwood to clean it off. The diameter of the holes is also important because if too small, the nails will be too difficult to drive in and could bend. If too large, the nails will go in too easy and not grip very well. We're using a 3mm drill bit for nails that are 3.15mm diameter, which works fine. Then we fit what we think is the last board, but we still have 3 full boards left over. And looking at the job as a whole, we can still see the rather ugly looking beams. So when we bought the timber some time ago, we must have allowed enough to cover these too, which means we need to fit a third row of boards. The issue with this is on the right hand side of the veranda, a third board won't fit because the concrete stumps are in the way. So we've had to cut the board around the stumps, which took a few tries to get right, but is looking pretty good. Much better than those beams. Then we need to nail this board on, like we have with all the others, with only one nail being used above the stumps, which should hold well, because there will be 2 nails elsewhere. We normally use 2 nails per joist to make sure that at least one nail will hold well, because sometimes the timber underneath has rotted away a little bit, and there isn't as much meat there to drive the nail in. Above these stumps is good solid hardwood, so that isn't a concern, and 2 nails would look a bit cluttered. The heads of the nails have a nice dome on them, and we don't need to sand this timber, so we can leave them as they are, so they become a feature, which is why we want them spaced nicely. We then add a third row of boards on the left side of the veranda too. That longer drill bit allows us to get the hole deeper than the length of the nail, so I have no nails bending over. These third boards are nailed straight to the main beam, so the nails could go anywhere, but we're putting them in line with the others because this looks the nicest. Once again, just as we think we've done the last board, we realise we've still got a third board to go on the steps. The difficulty here is there is a step in the way, which makes nailing that third board a little tricky. Another issue is there's a stump under there too, which is also in the way. We don't want to remove the step as this requires pulling everything apart.
Right, we've cut a piece of wood to fit in there, but we will need to notch around this stump. Just put a line in. Just mark that where the stump starts and where it finishes. And then it's about 50. Mark about 50 from the top there, and be a little higher. Because it's behind that step, so it's not really visible. Mark those ends. Right, we've trimmed that out. Now technically should slip down there. Although the board is a little bowed. I might need a bit of gentle persuasion. Knowing my luck, if you jam like that, you never come out again. Now what's the plan? Sit like that. Then I'll drill it from. If we can just get it in from here. Go in at an angle. Of course, it's really hardwood too. Right, now we also need to do a larger hole and a second drill. With a slightly larger bit in it. Now we probably can't nail that all the way in, but we can get it part way. I really don't know what the timber's like we're nailing into there. Just doesn't seem to be gripping. It's probably the hollow part. Now. We've hit something solid. We can't get the hammer in there, so we need a big fat punch. And a nice wide head on it so it doesn't slip off too easy.
We then repeated this with the other 4 nails, and this was definitely the last board, which brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we'll be filling in nail holes, sanding and oiling the rest of the decking and these steps, and get this veranda finished.